Good afternoon, Canada. Welcome to another True North Report. My name is Andrew Lawton, fellow with True North, here to talk about a case that has, quite surprisingly, I think, galvanized much of the country against Justin Trudeau. And I say surprisingly because it is a topic that's in the weeds. It's a topic that's complex, but it's one that has an impact on the average Canadian's bottom line, which is why I think it's been such an important thing to cover. And that is the federally imposed carbon tax that Justin Trudeau has steamrolled in and forced onto provinces that don't want it, that actually have, by definition, eschewed carbon pricing schemes, but the federal government looks to them and says, no, you're going to do it anyway because we told you so. And this is quite a fascinating time, because when Justin Trudeau first put this forward just about 2 years ago, there was just one opponent to it, and that was the province of Saskatchewan, then under the leadership of Brad Wall, who was absolutely a tremendous premier in Saskatchewan. And you fast forward 2 years later, and Brad Wall's gone, but there are actually 5 provinces that are united, not just in opposing carbon taxing from the federal government, but 5 provinces united in wanting to legally challenge the carbon tax. And I'm not talking about tiny little rinky-dink provinces here, but Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and New Brunswick. So 5 provinces, and combined about, I think it's about 65% of the population of the country that's in those provinces. And they're not just saying, we don't really like this whole carbon tax thing. They're saying, no, we're prepared to take Justin Trudeau to court over it. And this process has already started. A few weeks back, Saskatchewan argued its case in front of the Saskatchewan court. And 2 weeks ago, or I guess a week and a half ago, things wrapped up in Toronto at Osgoode Hall, where the Ontario government argued its case. And midway through that week-long hearing in Toronto, the United Conservative Party in Alberta won the election. One of Jason Kenney's promises is to use every legal tool at his disposal to fight Justin Trudeau's carbon tax, which means Ontario and Saskatchewan will soon be joined by Alberta in launching its own legal challenge. And yes, Manitoba also arguing its own legal challenge against the government. New Brunswick has taken the approach of, we're just going to let all these provinces do it, but we support you and are intervening on your behalf. And the reason I list these is because it's a tremendous amount of support, and it's all new. These aren't just your typical sticks in the mud like people expect of Alberta. These are provincial governments that have been newly and freshly elected in the last couple of years, in part because they're prepared to say to their citizens, you know what, we're going to fight against taxes and fight against rising costs. The federal government is imposing a tax, is imposing a rising cost. We're going to fight for you against them. And Trudeau is left holding the gas can when this is all said and done. And the reason I'm bringing this up now is because I was in the courtroom at Osgoode Hall in Toronto. It was a 4-day-long hearing. I was there for the entire thing, and I'm not trying to speak ill of my colleagues in media, but I was actually the only member of the media who was there for the entire thing. I was the only member of the media that was there all 4 days, let alone for every single part of every day of the hearing. I didn't leave. I barely ate and slept, but it's okay because it was important. And don't worry, I got some meals and sleep in. But here's the big problem in Canada right now, is that the battles that we're waging in the courtrooms in Saskatchewan and Ontario and soon in Alberta are, to the average Canadian, completely foreign. Most people aren't paying attention to it. The reason I was there is because it was tremendously important to me and to True North, and I think to a lot of the viewers of True North content, that we shine a light on what it is that's actually at stake. And we were very fortunate. We crowdfunded this. We don't get the $1.3 billion from the federal government that CBC does. We're not getting a piece of the federal government's $600 million media bailout fund. Everything we do is from people donating $25, $35, $50 at a time. And that was how I went to the carbon tax trial. We said to the viewers of True North, look, we want to do this. Here's how much it's going to cost. And people very generously donated. One person sent a private note. I don't know if he wants to be named, so I will respect just in case he doesn't, but donated $1,000 to doing this. And it was tremendous. We're very grateful for that. But the reason is because the federal government in this case is trying to rewrite the rules of how the federal government is allowed to govern. That's what they're doing. Justin Trudeau had his lawyer arguing before the Court of Appeal for Ontario, basically to give the federal government license to trample on provincial rights because they say climate change is the biggest danger that's facing Canada. And this is not just dangerous because it would give them license to steamroll ahead with this carbon tax, but it's dangerous because it would give the federal government the right to trample on your and my rights because they say that they don't like the way the provincial governments are doing things. And that's what's happening here. The federal government has its approach to carbon pricing. They want to put a price on carbon. They think this is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and by extension curb climate change and by extension meet Canada's UN commitments. Fine, that's what they think. But when provincial governments are not playing ball, the federal government goes in and says, okay, well, we're going to put a carbon tax on you anyway. And this is what happened. I live in Ontario, as you know. Ontario got rid of the cap and trade program that the previous Liberal government put into effect. And what does the federal government do? On April 1st, impose a carbon tax, jacking fuel prices up. And I know that there's a natural fluctuation in this, but I filled up my gas tank and it was $1.40. $1.40 a liter. And I don't live in British Columbia, thank goodness, where they've seen the impacts of carbon taxing to such an extent that I think it's like up over $1.70 something in BC. But the whole point of this is that even if not every increase in gas prices can be linked to a carbon tax, the carbon tax adds further strain on Canadians who rely on fuel, which I would actually challenge you to come up with a single Canadian who's not impacted by that. Even someone who lives in downtown Toronto and walks to work and drinks organic free-range, grain-fed soy lattes or whatever, is still reliant on fuel to do everything that they're doing. The coffee they pick up at their coffee shop, the food they order, all of these things rely on fuel. And it's why the carbon tax is in fact a tax on everything. But the federal government refuses to admit that it is a tax. And this was something that I wanted to go live today to explain, because I realized that this gets very in the weeds and it's not always the most interesting thing. But I was at the carbon tax trial and I heard the arguments from the federal government and the provincial government. And the federal government is trying to, I would say, hoodwink Canadians into thinking that something's happening that isn't actually happening. They do not believe that the carbon tax is a tax. They believe that a price on carbon is different than a tax on carbon, and the reason why is because it is, and this is the federal government's lawyer's position, because it's meant to change behavior. So of the few key questions, one of them was, is it a tax or is it a regulatory charge? And if it's a tax, and this was argued by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, this was argued by the Ontario government, this was argued by the Saskatchewan government, the federal government is allowed to impose a tax without any real issues. But if it's going to do that, it has to put forward a tax in a clear, transparent, and constitutional way. You can't put a tax in through a back door. You've got to call it a tax, and you've got to say, we hereby proclaim a tax, or whatever the wording is. But they've got to be honest about it and say, this is a tax that the federal government is enacting, that Parliament is enacting. And they didn't do that. They did not do that with the carbon price. What they did is say, no, this is a regulatory charge. But with that, there are some other rules attached to it. And one of them is that you've got to use the money you raise to actually advance the scheme to run the regulatory charge. Whereas what the federal government has done is taken the money levied through the carbon tax and tried to basically bribe Canadians. I should have actually brought it over here, but I got it in my mailbox, that little climate action incentive postcard where the federal government's trying to say, we're going to give you this much money because of the carbon tax. And one of the points that was argued by the government of Ontario's lawyer was that you can't say that this is helping emissions or anything when you could use that climate action incentive rebate to do something that is terrible for the environment. You could take it and say, I'm going to put it towards a payment on my Hummer. You could take it and say, I'm going to just buy a bunch of fuel and light it on fire. You could use that for pretty much anything you want, but it's a general bribe. And regardless of how much carbon you use, how many emissions you're responsible for, everyone in Canada, in Ontario, is getting the same amount of rebate because it's depending on where they live and not what they actually do. And the carbon price is punitive. But the heartbreaking part of it is that a great majority of people do not have the ability to live any less reliant a life on carbon. And I want to read a couple of comments here on this. Brenda says, hi, Andrew. Well, hi, Brenda. Thanks for tuning in. Steve O'Halloran has joined. Hey, Steve. Thanks for tuning in here. Cheryl writes, there is no way I can change my behavior to be more carbon neutral. This is key. This is absolutely key. Now, I use myself as an example right now because I don't drive a lot. I work from home. I fly a lot. I travel a lot for work, and the airlines have to pass along the rising cost of fuel to consumers. No company is going to eat a cost. They have to pass it on. So there is a reason that I travel. When I have to cover the carbon tax case, I need to be in Toronto. When I'm going over to the United Kingdom in a couple of weeks to cover a case, I have to fly there. I can't do that. So that money gets paid for by me, or by whoever it is for whom I'm working when I travel and I need to send that bill. So this is not something that I can choose to do less of. And maybe I could choose a different career, fine. But let's take a trucker who lives in Ottawa, a long distance trucker who is responsible for, picking up the oranges that are sent to a distribution center somewhere and driving them to a distribution center in Ottawa where another trucker will pick them up and bring them to grocery stores. Well, if you want an orange in downtown Ottawa, there is no way to get it that doesn't involve that orange being flown from Florida, driven from the cargo hold to the distribution center, driven from that. The list goes on of all of these things. If he's a self-employed trucker, he can't eat that cost. He's got to pay the carbon tax. He's got to pass it along to the grocery stores who pass it along to the consumer. And someone who lives in downtown Toronto that has a minuscule carbon footprint has to pay that carbon tax just because they want an orange. And I'm sorry, but not everyone is going to be growing these things in a greenhouse on the roof of your downtown Toronto condo. So the whole point of this is that it is punitive. It's not meant to curb behavior because a lot of people do not have the luxury of being able to change the behaviors that the government is trying to change. And this is why this whole idea that the federal government has put forward that, oh, no, it's a regulatory charge because we're trying to encourage people to live differently. What the government is arguing in court under oath is that they are attempting to manipulate Canadians. That's what this whole thing is. It is an effort by the federal government to manipulate Canadians into behaving the way the federal government wants you to behave, irrespective of science and irrespective of the cost that this approach has when it comes to the environment. Brenda writes, they want us all on transit, but you certainly won't see Trudeau taking the subway, bus, etc. No, and look, I realize that as the Prime Minister, we don't necessarily want him waiting on the subway line or the LRT line. But Brenda raises an important point here, which is that we just learned in the last few days that Trudeau has been spending tens of thousands of dollars in special flights to go on vacations and releasing, I don't know the exact number, but a monumental amount of greenhouse gas emissions into the environment, which he doesn't have to do. He could say, we're going to take all our vacations in Gatineau. We're going to take all our vacations within the walking distance of Rideau Cottage. But no, he says, look, I want to fly here. He has that right. He has the ability to do that. That is part of the things about living in a free country that I love. But he has the gall to do that while lecturing every other Canadian about the need to rein in what they're responsible for when it comes to emissions into the environment. And that is such a tremendous hypocrisy here that I think Trudeau is somehow being given a pass on by his supporters. And Catherine McKenna, same sort of thing. So I bring this around to the arguments at foot in the case, and that is predominantly that the federal government says, no, this isn't a tax, this is a regulatory charge. The provincial government says no. The other dimension of this that I want to share, and I'm going to apologize in advance if this comes across as excessively boring, But it is important because this is when I talked about the federal government trying to rewrite the rules of federal governance, what it is to which I'm referring. There is things, and the federal government is able to do other things. In those list of things that the federal government does, being able to impose a carbon tax on provinces is not listed. There is no reason that the federal government should be doing this, Ontario argues. The federal government argues that it is allowed to do so under one particular branch of the Constitution. And this is under the doctrine that's called POG, Peace, Order, and Good Government. There's a section about national concern doctrine, or the national concern branch. If an issue is deemed of national concern, the federal government is able to legislate on it, even if it trumps provincial jurisdiction. And the issue of national concern, the government argues, is that greenhouse gas emissions are a national concern. So the federal government does actually believe that it has the right to regulate greenhouse gas emissions because provinces can't. But clearly provinces can. And I look at Ontario as a fascinating example of this. Ontario has, believe it or not, reduced emissions in the last 15 years by 22%. The target set out by the federal government is 30%. So Ontario has already gotten a significant way to the 30% target that the federal government was the one that set. And a big part of this was because of the phase out of coal-fired electricity generation. But Ontario has been a leader in this. And this is something that you can look back to the Kathleen Wynne and Dalton McGuinty governments. Whether you like them or not, this is something they did. So Ontario is already ahead of the pack here. And one of the judges of the Court of Appeal for Ontario actually asked the federal lawyer, look, Ontario's getting already to 30%. We've 20% so far. Why does it need to be a carbon tax? If they can get there another way, why does it need to be a price on carbon that you impose on them? And there was no really good answer. All she said is, well, we're not here to talk about what the best way is. We're here just to talk about the fact that, yes, they need to do it, and the federal government has the right to make it happen. So I find this to be very disingenuous by the federal government, and I'll explain why. Because if the federal government succeeds in saying that it has the right to regulate greenhouse gas emissions because of national concern, then the federal government would have the right to regulate everything that causes greenhouse gas emissions under the same license. And this is not my own conspiracy theory. This is a theory that was advanced by the court. This was a theory that was advanced by the Ontario government's lawyer, by Saskatchewan government's lawyer, and by a number of legal scholars, that it would give the federal government the ability to say, you have to ban wood stoves in the province of Manitoba. You have to stop heating your home on above 22 degrees in the province of Ontario. You can't drive your cars on weekends or weekdays between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m. in the province of British Columbia, because these things all cause greenhouse gas emissions, which we think are an issue of national concern. Again, this is not me just conjecturing or speculating. This is an argument that was put forward by the court and by lawyers in the court saying, if you're going to claim that greenhouse gas emissions are a national concern, how can you not then be justified in restricting outside of your mandate everything that causes them? And all the federal government's lawyer could say was, well, that won't happen. Really? So the federal government's position, I just want to make this very clear, is just trust us. That is the federal government's claim, that we can just trust that it will limit itself. And she actually at one point said, the lawyer, who, again, she's doing her job, she's a lawyer, she is not the problem here, it's her client that's the problem. But she had said, well, the legislation in the future can be self-limiting. This was effectively the federal government's argument. And what was that old Ronald Reagan line? The most terrifying words in the English language, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Well, just trust us, I'd say, is right behind that, or at least at the same level here. Randy writes, I don't know why BC gas is going up if they already had a carbon tax. Well, Randy, I'm glad you mentioned that. So gas naturally fluctuates, and we're dealing with a period where there's a great deal of instability in this. But my point is that the carbon tax further adds. The carbon tax further adds on these burdens. I mean, yeah, the price of gas in BC is ridiculous, but the carbon tax has made it even more ridiculous and untenable. Sherry writes, Trudeau can fly anywhere while being a hypocrite on top of the carbon emission from his multiple personal vacations and jets and RCMP protection and lavish expenses. Carbon tax is a tax grab and nothing else. I hope here in Alberta, Jason Kenney will repeal it. Well, the good news is he's already pledged to. Premier designate Jason Kenney, who I've got a great deal of time and respect for, has said that he won't only get rid of the Alberta carbon tax, he'll also fight the federal carbon tax. But this is the challenge here, is that the second that he repeals the Alberta federal carbon or the Alberta carbon tax, the federal carbon tax goes into effect. So Trudeau will once again be imposing on a province that doesn't want it and doesn't need it a carbon tax. Bob writes, this country has no mass transit that allows rural people to travel about other than their cars or trucks. This will destroy any tourism to cottage country in Ontario if people cannot afford to travel. I'm retired, and trust me, my pension has not increased anywhere close to what my expenses are going up. I drive a car, and that is getting too expensive. Yeah, and this is one of the big things, Bob, and I thank you for that, that came about in Prince Edward Island. Now, PEI had its election last week. The PCs won. But remember, the PCs and PEI are not particularly conservative. It's just not a conservative province. It's a lot more community-focused and tight-knit. And I'm not saying that conservatism is at odds with community, but just that the dynamic is different than it is anywhere else. So the provincial government called in the election the carbon tax a tax grab, but now is saying they have no interest in fighting it. And again, no offense to PEI. One of our great writers at True North lives in PEI. I'm not objecting to the province itself, but it's not the hugest deal when it comes to the impact that PEI has on policy nationwide. But again, one point that I found interesting from the Premier Designate of PEI, Premier Designate King, is that he's saying, well, you know, okay, we're not going to fight the federal government, but we want the federal government to be more respectful of the PEI dynamic, in that we don't have any province-wide transit. We have cars. We have cars. That's the only way to get around there. So his argument, I think, is kind of undercutting his own point, which is that the federal imposition of a carbon tax doesn't respect local provinces can find their own solutions, and local provinces can have their own dynamics that are not respected by this. And Janelle writes, yeah, trust and government don't go together. Put that on a bumper sticker, Janelle, because it's never going to be less true at all. And, you know, it's funny, Janelle and Randy are both saying we need out of the UN. And I want to talk about the UN here, because it was quite dangerous, and I'd say quite terrifying, that during the federal carbon tax, or during the provincial carbon tax hearing in court in Toronto a couple of weeks ago, the federal government kept utilizing its UN targets, its Paris Climate Accords targets, as being part of the rationale for why the federal carbon tax has to be protected. This is what they were doing. They were saying, oh, well, no, but it's important because we have these climate targets we put to the UN. And no, we need to meet these climate targets. This is the act and the compact, if you will, that was said to Canadians to be non-binding, and now it's being used as the basis in court for imposing top-down taxing on Canadians. So this is, again, when we talked about the UN Migration Compact, and people like Candace Malcolm and Anthony Furey and myself were saying, no, they say non-binding, don't believe it. This is how. Because yes, it might be non-binding, but then it becomes the baseline for government to do other things that are binding, because they say, oh, well, we've got to make good on this, and we've got to meet this compact and this promise and this pledge and this accord and all of that. And as Steve O'Halloran points out here, Trudeau is more interested in winning friends and favor and winning a seat at the United Nations than he is at making sure that Canadians are being looked after by their government. And if you want proof of this, look at the fact that there were 6 provinces in Canada, 7 provinces actually, with a conservative government. Right across, you've got BC, which doesn't count because it's just BC. They're always crazy over there. And you've got Alberta conservative, Saskatchewan conservative, Manitoba conservative, Ontario Conservative, Quebec Conservative, New Brunswick PEI. There's 7. You've got one of the territories as well that's more conservative in nature, though technically independent. You've got a Newfoundland election coming up soon, which I don't know which way it's going to go. But again, even on the carbon tax alone, you went from one province, Saskatchewan, a couple of years ago, to now 5.5 that are against the Prime Minister on this. And this is what happens when Canadians feel like Trudeau is more interested at focusing on the UN and, you know, the big giant save the world stuff than on actual governance. And let me tell you the problem with this. I live in London, Ontario. And I haven't really been here much in the last couple of months, but I'm here now, back for a couple of weeks. And, you know, it's a great city. The council that we just elected is a lot better than the council we had before. But I was quite upset that when I came back from covering the carbon tax trial, I learned that my city council had voted to declare a state of emergency because of climate change. Yes, this is, this is it. My city voted, I think it was, what was the number? It was 12-3. There are 15 members of council, including the mayor, and they voted 12-3 to declare a climate change emergency in the city. And I think Montreal did this as well. I think Ottawa may have done this. A couple of other cities have done it. And firstly, it's completely baseless, useless virtue signaling that does nothing. Secondly, if there's an emergency, what are you doing about it? And this is the whole thing, is that if there is actually an emergency, how dare you drive a car? If there's actually an emergency, how dare you buy food and products that have been imported? If there's an because all of the people that say it's an emergency are complete and utter hypocrites. You get a couple that are genuinely good, honest, non-hypocritical people. You know, I know someone who is actually a lovely, wonderful person. She's committed to a zero waste lifestyle. She emits in her life 0 waste. She buys things that have only been reused. She grows a lot of stuff. She makes a lot of stuff. Obviously, she's got some footprint, but for the most part, she's leading by example. And I've got a lot more respect for that than I do for the people that, like Prince Charles or Leo DiCaprio, get off their private jets to tell everyone else they have to change, then get back on the jet and go to their second house. Or Justin Trudeau, who, you know, takes a plane trip. My favorite was the day that he went from Ottawa to Toronto and back, I think twice in a day, and then the next day did it again. And he tells us, oh, no, it's, you know, the family of 4 in the minivan that's causing all the problems. So the people that are genuinely leading by example in their lives, by the way, are not the ones telling everyone else what to do. The people telling everyone else what to do are these climate hypocrite hucksters that are declaring a state of emergency in a municipal government. And by the way, there are good people that vote for these motions because they feel they have to. I'm talking about the people that are aggressively driving this agenda. And it all ultimately leads back to people like Justin Trudeau and Catherine McKenna saying, but the UN. And when I heard the federal government citing the supposedly non-binding Paris Climate Accord in court as being a reason that the federal carbon tax must be declared constitutional, it was an example of just how deeply ingrained that flawed mindset is, that is being used to trample on provincial jurisdiction and by extension to trample on individual Canadians' rights. And this is only going to get worse, which is why I'm glad that we've got 5 provinces that are linking arms and fighting back. The resistance, as Maclean's called it, is now stronger, and it may well be that the carbon tax dies in the election in October before it dies in court, because remember, it's also got to go through and become a Supreme Court case. So we're not looking at a short-term battle here in the eyes of what's happening in court. So I bring all of this up so you understand exactly why it was important to cover it and what the stakes truly are on this. And I want to again give a big thank you to our donors who supported that coverage. We're going to be doing more special crowdfunding projects in the future because it is, like I said, the way that a small group like the True North Center and the True North Initiative can be able to do these things. So I thank you for that. If you want to, outside of a specific project, support what we're doing, head on over to tnc.news and click donate. You get a tax receipt. We are a charity. And specifically, I'd love for you to join the Andrew Lawton Heritage Club and support the work that I'm doing here. But in the meantime, my thanks to all of you for tuning in, for your comments. We'll talk to you soon, Canada. Thank you, God bless, and good day to you all.